The Bay of Pigs invasion, known in Latin America as Invasion de Playa Girón, was a failed military invasion of Cuba undertaken by the CIA-sponsored paramilitary group Brigade 2506 on 17 April 1961. A counter-revolutionary military, trained and funded by the United States government Central Intelligence Agency. Brigade 2506 fronted the armed wing of the Democratic Revolutionary Front and intended to overthrow the increasingly communist government of Fidel Castro. Launched from Guatemala, the invading force was defeated within 3 days by the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, under the direct command of Prime Minister Fidel Castro. The Cuban Revolution of 1952 to 1959 had forced dictator Fulgencio Batista, an ally of the United States, into exile. He was replaced by the 26th of July movement led by Castro, which severed the country's formerly strong links with the U.S. after expropriating the assets of U.S. corporations and mobsters, and developing links with the Soviet Union, with whom, at the time, the United States was engaged in the Cold War. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was concerned at the direction Castro's government was taking, and in March 1960, Eisenhower allocated $13.1 million to the CIA to plan Castro's overthrow. The CIA proceeded to organize the operation with the aid of various Cuban counter-revolutionary forces, training Brigade 2506 in Guatemala. Over 1,400 paramilitaries, divided into 5 infantry battalions and 1 paratrooper battalion, assembled in Guatemala before setting out for Cuba by boat on April 13, 1961. 2 days later, on April 15, 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers attacked Cuban airfields and then returned to the U.S. On the night of April 16, the main invasion landed at a beach named Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs. It initially overwhelmed a local revolutionary militia. The Cuban Army's counter-offensive was led by José Ramón Fernández, before Castro decided to take personal control of the operation. On April 20, the invaders finally surrendered, with the majority of troops being publicly interrogated and put into Cuban prisons. The failed invasion strengthened the position of Castro's leadership as well as his ties with the USSR. This led eventually to the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The invasion was a major embarrassment for U.S. foreign policy. U.S. President John F. Kennedy ordered a number of internal investigations across Latin America. Background: Cuba was for centuries part of the Spanish Empire. In the late 19th century, Cuban nationalist revolutionaries rebelled against Spanish dominance, resulting in 3 liberation wars: the 10 Years' War, the Little War and the Cuban War of Independence. Interested in extending its hegemony over Cuba, the crown jewel of the Spanish colonial empire, as a colony, the United States government proclaimed war on the Spanish Empire, resulting in the Spanish-American War. The U.S. subsequently invaded the island, and forced the Spanish army out. On May 20, 1902, a new independent government proclaimed the foundation of the Republic of Cuba, with U.S. military governor Leonard Wood handing over control to President Thomas Estrada Palmer, a Cuban-born American citizen. Subsequently, large numbers of U.S. settlers and businessmen arrived in Cuba, and by 1905, 60% of rural properties were owned by non-Cuban North Americans. Between 1906 to 1909, 5,000 U.S. Marines were stationed across the island, and returned in 1912, 1917 and 1921 to intervene in internal affairs, sometimes at the behest of the Cuban government. Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Until Castro, the U.S. was so overwhelmingly influential in Cuba that the American ambassador was the second most important man, sometimes even more important than the Cuban president. Earl T. Smith, former American ambassador to Cuba, during 1960 testimony to the U.S. Senate in March 1952, a Cuban general and politician, Fulgencio Batista, seized power on the island, proclaimed himself president and deposed the discredited President Carlos Prior Socorros of the Partido Autotocor. Batista cancelled the planned presidential elections and described his new system as disciplined democracy. Although he gained some popular support, many Cubans saw it as the establishment of a one-man dictatorship. Many opponents of the Batista regime took to armed rebellion in an attempt to oust the government, sparking the Cuban Revolution. One of these groups was the National Revolutionary Movement, a militant organization containing largely middle-class members that had been founded by the professor of philosophy Rafael Garcia Bárcena. Another was the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, which had been founded by the Federation of University Students President José Antonio Echeverría. However, the best-known of these anti-Batista groups was the 26th of July movement, founded by a lawyer named Fidel Castro, consisting of both a civil and a military committee. The former conducted political agitation through an underground newspaper, while the latter armed and trained recruits to take violent action against Batista. With Castro as the Mr. 26-7's head, the organization was based upon a clandestine cell system, with each cell containing 10 members, none of whom knew the whereabouts or activities of the other cells. Between December 1956 and 1959, Castro led a guerrilla army against the forces of Batista from his base camp in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The Batista's repression of revolutionaries had earned him widespread unpopularity, and by 1958, his armies were in retreat. On 31 December 1958, Batista resigned, and fled into exile, taking with him an amassed fortune of more than $300 million. The presidency fell to Castro's chosen candidate, the lawyer Manuel Arrucha Lelio, while members of the Mr. 26-7 took control of most positions in the cabinet. On 16 February 1959, Castro himself took on the role of prime minister. Dismissing the need for elections, Castro proclaimed the new administration an example of direct democracy, in which the Cuban populace could assemble en masse at demonstrations and express their democratic will to him personally. Critics instead condemned the new regime as undemocratic. The counter-revolution soon after the success of the Cuban Revolution, militant counter-revolutionary groups developed in an attempt to overthrow the new regime, undertaking armed attacks against government forces. Some set up guerrilla bases in Cuba's mountainous regions, leading to the 6-year war against the bandits. These dissidents were funded and armed by various foreign sources, including the exiled Cuban community, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and the Dominican government of General Rafael Trujillo. No quarter was given during the suppression of the resistance in the Escambray Mountains, where former rebels from the war against Batista took different sides. On 3 April 1961, a bomb attack on militia barracks in Bayamo killed 4 militia, and wounded 8 more. On 6 April, the Hershey sugar factory in Matanzas was destroyed by sabotage. On 14 April 1961, guerrillas led by Agapito Rivera fought Cuban government forces near Las Cruces, Montembo, Las Villas, where several government troops were killed and others wounded. Also on 14 April 1961, a Cubana airliner was hijacked and flown to Jacksonville, Florida. Resultant confusion then helped discovery of the staged defection of a B-26 and pilot at Miami on 15 April. Castro's government began a crackdown on this opposition movement, arresting hundreds of dissidents. Though it rejected the physical torture Batista's regime had used, Castro's government sanctioned psychological torture. subjecting some prisoners to solitary confinement, rough treatment, hunger, and threatening behavior. After conservative editors and journalists began expressing hostility towards the government following its leftward turn, the pro-Castro Printers Trade Union began to harass and disrupt editorial staff. In January 1960, the government proclaimed that each newspaper was obliged to publish a clarification by the Printers Union to the end of any article that criticized the government. This was the start of press censorship in Castro's Cuba. Popular uproar across Cuba demanded that those figures who had been complicit in the widespread torture and killing of civilians be brought to justice. Although he remained a moderating force and tried to prevent the mass reprisal killings of Batistanos advocated by many Cubans, Castro helped to set up trials of many figures involved in the old regime across the country, resulting in hundreds of executions. Although widely popular in Cuba, critics, in particular from the U.S. press, argued that many of these did not meet the standards of a fair trial, and condemned Cuba's new government as being more interested in vengeance than justice. Castro retaliated strongly against such accusations, proclaiming that revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but on moral conviction. In a show of support for this revolutionary justice, he organized the first Havana trial to take place before a mass audience of 17,000 at the Sports Palace Stadium, when a group of aviators accused of bombing a village were found not guilty. He ordered a retrial, in which they were instead found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. On the 11th of March 1961, Jesus Carreras and American William Alexander Morgan were executed after a trial. Tensions with the United States. Castro's Cuban government ordered the country's oil refineries, then controlled by U.S. corporations Esso and Standard Oil and Anglo-Dutch Shell, to process crude oil purchased from the Soviet Union, but under pressure from the U.S. government, these companies refused. Castro responded by expropriating the refineries and nationalizing them under state control. In retaliation, the U.S. cancelled its import of Cuban sugar, provoking Castro to nationalize most U.S.-owned assets on the island, including banks and sugar mills. Relations between Cuba and the U.S. were further strained following the explosion and sinking of a French vessel, the La Cuba, in Havana harbor in March 1960, carrying weapons purchased from Belgium. The cause of the explosion was never determined, but Castro publicly insinuated that the U.S. government were guilty of sabotage. On the 13th of October 1960, the U.S. government then prohibited the majority of exports to Cuba, the exceptions being medicines and certain foodstuffs, marking the start of an economic embargo. In retaliation, the Cuban National Institute for Agrarian Reform took control of 383 private-run businesses on the 14th of October, and on the 25th of October a further 166 U.S. companies operating in Cuba had their premises seized and nationalized, including Coca-Cola and Sears Roebuck. On the 16th of December, the U.S. then ended its import quota of Cuban sugar, the country's primary export. The U.S. government was becoming increasingly critical of the direction Castro's revolutionary government was taking Cuba. At an August 1960 meeting of the Organization of American States held in Costa Rica, the U.S. Secretary of State Christian Herter publicly proclaimed that Castro's administration was following faithfully the Bolshevik pattern by instituting a single-party political system, taking governmental control of trade unions, suppressing civil liberties, and removing both the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He furthermore asserted that international communism was using Cuba as an operational base for spreading revolution in the Western Hemisphere, and called on other OAS members to condemn the Cuban government for its breach of human rights. In turn, Castro lambasted the treatment of black people and the working classes he had witnessed in New York City, which he lampooned as that super-free, super-democratic, super-humane, and super-civilized city, proclaiming that the American poor were living in the bowels of the imperialist monster. He attacked the mainstream U.S. media and accused it of being controlled by big business.